Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that looked absolutely lovely on the surface. All Empire waist gowns, candlelit ballrooms, and men in tight breeches making meaningful eye contact across a drawing room, and was, in practice, a deeply strange, surprisingly disgusting, and occasionally terrifying place to be alive. We're talking about Regency England, the real one, not the Netflix version with the flawless skin and the anachronistic saxophone music. I mean the actual Regency Era, roughly 1811 to 1820, where the things people did completely casually would make your jaw drop, your stomach turn, and your dermatologist weep. But first, a huge genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you have excellent taste in historical suffering. Comments like yours are genuinely what shape this channel, and I mean that. If you're enjoying what I do here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure, just know it helps more than you'd think. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always, without fail, 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, the channel is now on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off through your headphones tonight, the link is in the description. Go find us there. Now, dim the lights, put a fan on if you've got one, pull that blanket up, get truly, genuinely comfortable, because you are about to feel very, very smug about living in the modern era. But before we begin, let's just sit with a few questions, shall we? Have you ever wondered what Regency people actually smelled like up close? Did anyone in Jane Austen's world ever just openly discuss their bowel movements at the dinner table? Was there a doctor in the building, or just a very confident man with a bottle of mercury? Could a woman be declared legally insane for simply disagreeing with her husband? What exactly was in the food? What was happening with the teeth? And most importantly, if you had somehow woken up in Regency England, how long before something completely routine absolutely destroyed you? Congratulations, you've just woken up in England. The year is 1814, Napoleon is almost finished, the Prince Regent is throwing parties that cost more than your entire village, and somewhere nearby, a physician is about to prescribe arsenic for your complexion. Welcome. Try not to touch anything. Let's talk about waking up in Regency England, because the first 20 minutes of your day already contain 3 things that could kill you. You peel yourself off a mattress stuffed with wool and horsehair, comfortable enough, assuming you've never tried a modern mattress, and shuffle toward the washstand. No running water, no hot shower, just a ceramic basin, a pitcher of cold water hauled up by a servant who woke 2 hours before you did, and a bar of soap that smells like rendered animal fat, because that is in fact what it is. If you're a woman of any social standing, the real morning ritual begins at the dressing table, where your lady's maid opens a small pot of face powder and begins dusting your skin with something white, smooth, and absolutely loaded with lead. Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from white lead, was still fashionable in certain circles, and even the rice powder alternatives weren't exactly dermatologist approved. You're essentially priming yourself for the day with slow-acting poison, and the terrifying part is everyone around you is doing it too, nodding approvingly, saying you look very well indeed. The lead wasn't incidental, it was the point. White skin, pale, almost translucent, was the beauty ideal, signalling that you were a person of leisure who did not labour outdoors, who did not tan, who spent her time indoors being refined and expensive. The whiter, the better. The fact that the compounds used to achieve this pallor caused hair loss, skin discoloration, neurological damage, and in prolonged use, death, was known to some physicians and largely ignored by everyone else. Women who developed the grey, pitted complexion that came from years of lead exposure simply applied more powder to cover it, which is the beauty equivalent of responding to a house fire by adding more furniture. And it wasn't just the face. You had your hair to consider. Regency hairstyles for women were relatively natural compared to the towering powdered constructions of the previous century, but achieving that artfully casual Grecian look still required a lady's maid working for a considerable amount of time with heated curling irons, papers, pomades, and pins. The irons were heated directly in the fire and tested, sometimes on the maid's own wrist, for appropriate temperature before application, which was a system that worked reasonably well right up until it didn't. Singed hair was a known occupational hazard of the morning. You simply carried a little extra pomade for emergencies. For men, the morning was its own theatre. The Regency dandy, the Beau Brummel school of masculine elegance, spent hours achieving what appeared to be effortless perfection. Cravats were starched so stiffly they restricted neck movement, then tied in arrangements so complex that failed attempts were simply thrown on the floor by valets trained to expect a pile of discarded linen before success was achieved. Boots were polished to a mirror shine. Brummel allegedly used champagne in his boot blacking, though this may have been reputation management rather than genuine practice. Breeches were so fitted they were effectively a second skin, pulled on with great effort and worn without anything so unflattering as a wrinkle. Looking this natural took approximately 3 hours. Underneath all of this, the body was managed with considerably less refinement. A sponge bath, perhaps, a change of linen, the shirt or shift worn against the skin being changed more frequently than outer garments, which were brushed rather than washed. Clean linen was the Regency standard of cleanliness. If your visible linen was white, you were clean, in the same way that if your floors look clean from a distance, you haven't looked at them closely enough. By the time you've been powdered, pinned, laced, and polished, it's nearly time for breakfast. You look beautiful. You smell like pomade and coal smoke and very faintly of animal fat soap. You're ready. You have lead on your face. Good morning, Regency England. It's time for breakfast. And the good news is that if you're upper middle class or above in Regency England, you will actually eat. The bad news is what you'll eat and what's living in it. The Regency breakfast was not the modest cup of tea and slice of toast you might imagine from period dramas. For the gentry, it was a spread: cold meats, potted fish, eggs, bread, butter, perhaps a kidney or two, all laid out on a sideboard and left to sit at room temperature in a home that, depending on the season, was either freezing or fly-filled. Refrigeration didn't exist. Food preservation relied almost entirely on salt, vinegar, smoke, and optimism. The butter you're spreading on your bread has been sitting in a ceramic crock since Tuesday. The potted shrimp smell a little assertive, but everyone's ignoring it because this is simply how shrimp smell apparently, and to suggest otherwise would be rude. The sideboard system was elegant in theory. You walked in, surveyed the offerings, chose what appealed, and helped yourself or waited for a footman to assist. In practice, the food had been prepared anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours earlier, carried from a kitchen that was often in a basement or separate wing of the house, specifically so cooking smells wouldn't intrude on the family's living spaces, and placed in covered dishes that retained some warmth for a while and then simply gave up. The eggs were cooked correctly when they left the kitchen. By the time they reached the table, they were either cold or they'd been sitting over a warming stand and were now the texture of a small rubber disc. Either way, you ate them because this was breakfast and there was toast. The tea was important. Not just socially important, though it was emphatically that, and the correct handling of a teacup was an observable signal of breeding, but practically important because it was hot, it was safe to drink, and it was one of the more reliable elements of the meal. Coffee was available too, growing in fashionability among the upper classes. Chocolate, thick, rich, heavily sweetened, was a breakfast luxury for the very wealthy. If you were drinking chocolate at breakfast in Regency England, you were essentially announcing that money was not a concern you entertained. For the poor, none of this applies. Breakfast for a working family was bread if there was bread, porridge, weak tea if they could afford the leaves, which were expensive enough that used leaves were sometimes sold by wealthier households to poorer ones, the flavour extracted twice in a system of cheerful frugality. Meat at breakfast was an aspiration. In lean years, and there were lean years, harvests failed, grain prices spiked, and the working poor felt it immediately and severely. Breakfast was simply not a meal that happened in any meaningful way. The word breakfast was not so much a meal as a concept, available to those with the funds to actualise it. Back in the gentry's dining room, someone has noticed that the cold ham smells slightly unusual. Nobody says anything. You don't say anything about ham at the breakfast table. The hostess continues pouring tea. The footman refills the toast rack. A fly lands on the remaining portion of potted shrimp and is discreetly waved away. This is fine. This is a perfectly normal Regency breakfast. And then someone mentions that the butter from the market this week seems a little off, and 3 people simultaneously change the subject to the weather, because some things are simply not discussed. You finish your tea. You've eaten enough to continue functioning. Whether everything you ate will continue to agree with you throughout the day is something you'll find out around mid-afternoon, and you'll deal with it then. Let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the ceramic vessel under the bed. Indoor plumbing in Regency England was essentially non-existent for the vast majority of people, and even in the finest townhouses in Bath or London, the toilet situation was something that polite society had collectively agreed never to discuss directly, which is exactly why we're going to discuss it in great detail. The chamber pot was a fixture of daily life, kept under the bed or inside a small cabinet called a close stool used throughout the night and emptied by servants in the morning. At formal dinners, it was not unusual for a pot to be kept in the sideboard of the dining room, so that gentlemen didn't have to interrupt their port and conversation for something as inconvenient as biology. The contents were then carried downstairs, through the kitchen area, and disposed of, often into a cesspit beneath or behind the house that was emptied periodically by men called night soil collectors, who arrived after dark, shovelled it out by hand and carted it away. The smell on those nights was something no candle could fix. The close stool, a padded seat with a chamber pot concealed inside a box or cabinet, was considered the more refined option, the difference between squatting with a ceramic bowl and sitting on something that at least looked like furniture. Great houses sometimes had dedicated dressing rooms or small closets where these were kept, affording a degree of privacy that was genuinely considered luxurious. At Chatsworth, at Blenheim, at the grandest country estates, there were privy arrangements that were considerably more sophisticated than the average. But even here, no running water, no flush, no mechanism for removal other than a servant's hands and a covered pail. Outside the house things were worse. City streets in London were not built with pedestrian dignity in mind. You walked carefully, you watched where you stepped, and if you were caught short while out in public, you had limited options. There were some public facilities, rudimentary arrangements in certain areas, but they were not convenient, not clean, and not always findable when urgently needed. The solution adopted by many was simply to use whatever was available: doorways, alleys, the Thames embankment, the gap between a wall and a fence. This was not considered respectable behaviour, but it was considered inevitable behaviour, which says something about the infrastructure. The cesspit, meanwhile, sat beneath the house and filled. Night soil men came round quarterly, or when things became particularly pressing, which in summer, when decomposition accelerated and the smell rose through the floorboards, with a conviction that no amount of strewing herbs could address, could be more frequent. These men charged for their services. The collected material was then sold as agricultural fertiliser, which closed the loop in a way that Regency people preferred not to think about too carefully when they sat down to breakfast. There was in this period the very earliest flickering of a different possibility. A handful of experimental water closets had been installed in some wealthy homes. A mechanical flush toilet of sorts had been patented as far back as 1778, but they were novelties, expensive, often unreliable, and connected to drainage systems that in many cases simply moved the problem rather than solving it, emptying into the same cesspits or directly into the nearest river. The Thames, to put it delicately, was doing a great deal of work in this era. And so the chamber pot endured, emptied each morning by a housemaid who had drawn this particular short straw in the domestic lottery, carried downstairs in a covered pail, and dealt with in the time-honoured fashion. Nobody talked about it. Everybody used one. It was, like so many things in Regency England, a system that worked only if you agreed not to examine it too carefully, which everyone enthusiastically did. If you got sick in Regency England, your first instinct might be to see a physician. Your second instinct, once you understood what a physician would do to you, would be to take your chances with the illness. Regency medicine operated on the tail end of humoral theory, the ancient belief that the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and the cure for most things was to aggressively remove one of them. Got a fever? Bloodletting, feeling sluggish, purging, anxious, melancholy, or simply inconveniently female. Mercury. Physicians would drain blood from patients who were already dangerously weak, administer laxatives to people who had barely eaten, and prescribe compounds containing mercury, arsenic, and antimony with the calm confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea what a germ was. Which, to be fair, they didn't. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 50 years. In the meantime, the treatment was often significantly more dangerous than the disease, and the doctor left feeling quite satisfied. The medical profession in Regency England was stratified with the same rigid hierarchy it applied to everything else. At the top sat the physicians, university-educated, often holding degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, or Edinburgh, able to diagnose and prescribe but considered too refined to actually touch the patient with their own hands most of the time. Below them were the surgeons, who did the cutting, the setting, the lancing, the more visceral interventions, and below them the apothecaries, who filled prescriptions and in practice served as the general practitioners for anyone who couldn't afford a proper physician. The 3 groups guarded their distinctions jealously. A physician who was seen performing surgery was embarrassing himself. An apothecary who diagnosed rather than simply dispensed was overstepping. The patient existed somewhere in the middle of this turf war, hoping everyone had read the same notes. Surgery was its own particular experience. There was no anaesthesia. Ether wouldn't be demonstrated until 1846. And chloroform shortly after. If you needed an operation in 1814, you were given alcohol if you were lucky, told to hold still if you were not, and restrained by several strong assistants if the holding still proved optimistic. Speed was the primary surgical virtue. A good amputation took under a minute. This was not because Regency surgeons were sloppy. The best of them were remarkably precise by the standards of what they were working with, but because every additional second under the knife was additional agony with no numbering agent available, and the patient's survival probability dropped with each passing moment. You practiced until you were fast, then you practiced more. Infection killed a significant proportion of surgical patients afterward, because the link between cleanliness and recovery was not understood. Surgeons operated in the same coats they wore all day, the accumulated stains of previous procedures worn as a badge of experience rather than a hygiene concern. Instruments were wiped between uses, not sterilized. Wound dressings were reused. The wards of hospitals, where they existed, were crowded, underventilated, and excellent vectors for the spread of exactly the diseases they were supposed to be treating. Florence Nightingale's reforms were still decades away, and the death rates in hospitals reflected this honestly. The wealthier you were, the more of this you could avoid: treatment at home, your own physician, your own room. The poorer you were, the more likely you were to end up in a voluntary hospital or a workhouse infirmary, where the care was provided by staff whose training varied enormously and whose resources were severely limited. And so you weighed it up. The illness on one side, the physician on the other. Sometimes the illness won, sometimes the physician won. Occasionally, against the available odds, you did. Now would be a good time to talk about teeth, specifically the state of them, and the deeply unhinged methods people use to address the problem. The Regency era sat right in the sweet spot of sugar becoming more affordable for the middle classes, and dentistry being, let's say, aspirational. Toothbrushes existed, bone handles, stiff bristles, occasionally horsehair, and tooth powders were widely sold, containing charcoal, chalk, ground cuttlefish bone, and sometimes brick dust, which was exactly as abrasive as it sounds. If you had a toothache, you had options. You could apply oil of cloves directly and hope. You could pack the cavity with lead. You could visit a tooth drawer, not a dentist in any modern sense, but a man, often also a barber or a blacksmith, who would extract the tooth with pliers while you gripped the chair and reconsidered every life choice that had led to this moment. And all of this was done without anesthesia, because anesthesia wouldn't exist for another 30 years. You simply screamed and got on with it. The social consequences of poor teeth were significant in a society that prized appearances above almost everything else. Bad teeth were associated with age, poverty, and poor constitution. Wealthy people understood this and attempted solutions. The most elaborate of these was the transplant. If a wealthy patient lost a tooth and wanted a replacement, a living donor, usually a poor person, often very young, who had been paid a small fee, would have a healthy tooth pulled immediately before the transplant, and the still warm tooth would be pressed into the socket in the wealthy patient's jaw and held in place while everyone hoped the body would accept it. Success rates were poor. The more reliable outcome was that the recipient contracted syphilis or some other disease from the donor tooth, which compounded the dental problem with something considerably worse, and is, objectively, one of the worst possible returns on a small investment in one smile. For those who had lost enough teeth to affect appearance, which in an era of high sugar, no fluoride, no fillings, and lead-based toothache remedies was a very large number of people, false teeth were available. The options were ivory, carved from elephant or walrus tusk, which discoloured quickly and absorbed odours in ways that were not pleasant. Porcelain teeth existed and held their colour better, but were brittle and prone to catastrophic failure at inopportune moments. And then there were Waterloo teeth, a category that tells you everything you need to know about the Regency era's relationship with creative problem-solving and absolutely nothing you wanted to know before dinner. These were human teeth, extracted from the mouths of soldiers killed at Waterloo in 1815, and sold to dentists and tooth drawers who fitted them into dentures. Soldiers moved through the battlefield after the fighting, pulling teeth from the dead, and the resulting supply was large enough that the name stuck for decades and referred to any human tooth harvested from a corpse, regardless of which battle. You could purchase, at a Regency dentist's rooms, a set of dentures made from the teeth of young men who'd been alive and walking around 18 months earlier. People did. Regularly. If you had teeth, your own, someone else's, or carved from the tusk of an animal, you needed to maintain them, and tooth powders were the primary tool. They cleaned, after a fashion. The abrasive ones removed surface stains effectively, and also removed enamel with the same lack of discrimination, which accelerated the decay they were meant to address. Formulations containing borax, orris root, and camphor were somewhat less destructive. Formulations containing ground glass, which did appear in some fraudulent commercial powders, were considerably more so. And then you smiled, carefully, in good company, with your lips arranged to reveal the minimum. Or you smiled openly if you were young and lucky and still had a full complement of your own teeth, which was a gift worth appreciating because it was, in Regency England, entirely temporary. Here is something no period drama will tell you. Regency England smelled, not in a minor occasional way, in a constant, layered, occasionally overwhelming way that touched every corner of life from the grandest assembly room to the humblest cottage. Let's start at the top. The streets of London and Bath were shared by horses, thousands of them, which meant the roads were perpetually carpeted in manure. A single horse produces roughly 40 pounds of it per day. Multiply that by the tens of thousands of horses in London alone, and you start to understand why walking anywhere required a certain amount of strategic navigation. Add to this the open sewers, the coal smoke from every hearth in the city, the Thames, which was, diplomatically speaking, not at its freshest, and the fact that most people bathed infrequently and laundered their clothes even less often, and you have an olfactory experience that no amount of rosewater, orange peel, or smelling salts could fully address. The smell of the streets was so accepted, so embedded in daily life, that Londoners essentially stopped registering it as unusual. Visitors from the countryside arriving in the city for the first time often recorded their shock. The combination of coal smoke, horse traffic, tanneries, slaughterhouses, fish markets, leather works and human waste created what one might generously call a complex urban fragrance profile. Less generously, it was a smell that attached itself to your clothing within minutes and became indistinguishable from your own personal atmosphere within hours. You carried London home with you on your coat every evening. Indoor spaces were not a significant improvement. Candles, tallow candles, the ones ordinary people used, made from rendered animal fat rather than the expensive beeswax candles of the wealthy, produced their own particular smell as they burned. A low, slightly rancid undertone that mixed with the coal fire and the cooking smells and the general domestic accumulation of a household where windows were kept firmly shut against the cold for most of the year. Great houses burning beeswax throughout were genuinely more fragrant, which is one of the more straightforward class distinctions of the era. You could smell, quite literally, how wealthy someone was. Assembly rooms and ballrooms presented the most acute version of this challenge. Almack's, the most exclusive assembly rooms in London, admitted several hundred elegantly dressed people into a space heated by candles and warming fires, where they danced vigorously for several hours. Dancing raises the body temperature. Raised body temperature accelerates perspiration. Perspiration in heavy silk and wool, because evening dress in this period was not light, produces results that no quantity of lavender water dabbed at the wrists entirely disguises. The smelling salts that fashionable women carried were not affectation. They were practical equipment for navigating crowded, heated social spaces where the air quality dropped in direct proportion to how good a time everyone was having. Perfume existed and was used enthusiastically, but it was layered on top of rather than in replacement of everything else, which meant that a woman at the height of fashion smelled of rosewater and musk and powder and perspiration, and the candle smoke that had attached itself to her hair, all at once, simultaneously. This was not considered a problem. This was simply what people smelled like, and everyone agreed not to notice. The countryside comparatively smelled of animals, mud, decomposing vegetation, and the particular fragrance of a farm that has been a farm for several generations. Fresh air in Regency England was a relative concept. It meant outdoor air, which was at least moving, which was a meaningful distinction from indoor air, which generally wasn't. Nobody was getting lung cleanses. They were just deciding which specific combination of smells they preferred, and calling the one they chose fresh. It might surprise you to learn that in Regency England, bathing was considered not a hygiene practice but a medical event. You didn't bathe to get clean, you bathed as a treatment, prescribed for specific ailments, undertaken with some trepidation, and not repeated too frequently lest it weaken the constitution. The dominant belief was that the skin had a protective layer, often described as a kind of natural varnish, that should not be too vigorously disturbed. Full immersion baths were rare, particularly in winter, and for many people meant having a wooden or metal tub dragged into the bedroom, filled bucket by bucket with water heated over the kitchen fire by servants who had other things to do. Sponge baths were more common, a cloth, a basin, and targeted attention to the visible parts. The face, neck, and hands were washed daily. These were the surfaces the world could see, and appearances mattered. Everything else was dealt with on a schedule that modern hygienists would describe as ambitious. The logistics of a full bath in a Regency house were considerable enough to explain its infrequency without requiring any theory about protective skin varnish. Water came from a pump in the yard, a well, or a water carrier if you lived in a city and were willing to pay. It was carried inside in buckets or jugs, heated over the kitchen fire in pots, a process that took time, fuel, and a sustained allocation of servant labour that a busy household could not always provide without disruption to the rest of the day's operations. The tub itself, tin, zinc, or wood, was carried upstairs, positioned before the fire for warmth, filled, and then sat in briefly before the water cooled enough to become unpleasant. Then it was all dismantled, the water carried back downstairs and disposed of, the tub dried and stored. For all of this, you got perhaps 15 minutes of warm water. Whether this was worth a significant fraction of the household's working day was a calculation every family made differently. Wealthier households had somewhat better arrangements. Dedicated bathroom spaces were beginning to appear in the grandest homes, rooms with proper bathing tubs, attached dressing rooms, arrangements for hot water delivery. These were novelties, remarked upon with the enthusiasm usually reserved for new technology, because that is essentially what they were. Most houses did not have them. Most people bathed in their bedrooms in front of the fire, in a tub that barely accommodated a seated adult, and considered this an adequate arrangement. What filled the gap between full baths was a system of targeted cleaning that the Regency called dry bathing for the body, and focused on linen for the principle of cleanliness. The shirt or shift worn against the skin was changed daily, more frequently than outer garments, which were brushed, aired, and pressed rather than washed. The theory was that clean linen absorbed the body's impurities, transferring them away from the skin and, if changed regularly, maintaining a state of acceptable cleanliness without the drama of full immersion. This was not an unreasonable theory given the available options. It was also not, by modern standards, quite sufficient. Perfume performed considerable compensatory work in this system. Lavender water, rose water, hungry water, a spirit-based preparation of rosemary and other herbs were used liberally on the skin and clothing. Pomanders of scented herbs and spices were carried. Sachets of lavender were placed in clothing storage. Scented gloves were fashionable. The effect was not to mask uncleanness. People did not think of themselves as dirty because they were operating within the standards of their time, but to present a fragrant, well-maintained personal environment. And within those standards, most people were doing their earnest best. The earnest best, objectively assessed from a modern vantage point, still involved bathing perhaps once a month if things were going well, and once a season if they weren't. This is, by any contemporary standard, a different relationship with water than the one we maintain, and if you are currently doing a mental calculation about what that means for a crowded ballroom in July, the calculation is correct. You've done the maths. Now go appreciate your shower. If you were a child in Regency England, your life had a specific set of indignities lined up for you that began at birth and didn't really let up. Newborns were swaddled, tightly wrapped in long bands of cloth that restricted all limb movement, under the theory that this would ensure the limbs grew straight. After that, boys and girls alike were dressed in long gowns until the age of roughly 4 or 5, at which point boys were breeched, put into trousers for the first time, an occasion their families celebrated as a milestone. Girls were put into increasingly restrictive clothing as they aged, including stays, a junior version of a corset from the time they were quite small, because a straight posture was considered morally as well as physically important. Add to this the fact that children of the working class were put to work as soon as they were physically capable of it, and children of the gentry were handed off to wet nurses, then nursemaids, then governesses, spending relatively little time with their actual parents, and childhood in Regency England looks less like an idyll and more like a sequence of managed inconveniences. The distance between upper-class parents and their children was not coldness, or not only coldness, but a deliberate social arrangement. Infants went to wet nurses, sometimes in the nurse's own home for the first year of life, returning to their parents' house as small toddlers already walked past the first dangerous months. This was considered sensible management, removing the infant from the main household during the noisiest, most disruptive period and allowing the mother to return to social life more quickly. Whether the child had opinions about being sent to a stranger's house for its first year was not a variable that factored significantly into the arrangement. Once children returned to the household, they inhabited a separate domestic world. The nursery and schoolroom were their territory. They ate separately, slept separately, and appeared in the drawing room when summoned, in their best clothes, on their best behaviour, for a period of time that was usually measured in minutes before being sent away again. This is not entirely unlike a job interview, except that the interviewers were your parents and the position you were auditioning for was their continued affection, which children of the Regency were trained to earn through good behaviour rather than expect as a default. Toys existed, hoops, tops, wooden dolls, simple games, but play was always threaded through with a consciousness of education and improvement. Books for children began to flourish in this period, a positive development, though many of them were relentlessly moral in tone, featuring children who told small lies and were subsequently destroyed by a series of escalating consequences that made the punishment seem wildly disproportionate to the crime. The lesson was clear: obedience, piety, and the appropriate suppression of selfish impulses were the cardinal virtues of childhood. Joy was acceptable in its correct, supervised form. For children of the poor, childhood was a much shorter affair. The age at which children were considered capable of contributing to the household economy was startlingly young by modern standards. Gleaning in the fields, minding younger siblings, running errands, helping with domestic work, all of this began early. Factory work, chimney sweeping, agricultural labour. The world of child employment was vast, largely unregulated, and considered a normal feature of the economic landscape, rather than something requiring remedy. The idea that childhood was a protected developmental stage deserving specific legal safeguards would take most of the rest of the century to gain serious traction. In 1814, a 6-year-old with a job was simply a child who was pulling their weight, and there were plenty of them. Let's spend some time with the corset because it deserves it. The Regency corset is often misrepresented. This period actually favoured a softer, higher-waisted silhouette compared to the brutal Victorian hourglass that came later. But let's not pretend that fashionable Regency dressing was comfortable, because it emphatically was not. Stays were worn by virtually all women who wished to be considered respectable, from the very young to the elderly, from morning to evening, tightened by a lacing at the back that required either a cooperative maid or a remarkable degree of personal flexibility. They shaped the torso, supported the bust, and dictated posture in a way that left very little room for something as frivolous as a deep breath. The white muslin gowns fashionable in the early Regency era were deliberately thin and clinging, inspired by classical Greek drapery, which looked magnificent in a warm drawing room and functioned approximately as well as wearing a damp handkerchief in an English winter, which killed quite a number of fashionable women in what newspapers grimly reported as muslin disease. Muslin disease was not a disease. It was pneumonia and its consequences, contracted by women who had dressed for a warm ideal in an actual climate that averaged 9 degrees and damp, and had opinions about thin fabric. The fashion plates that circulated showing elegant women in diaphanous gowns were drawn indoors in theoretical warmth by illustrators who were not personally exposed to the English weather. The women who followed those fashions were, and they suffered for it, with a statistical consistency that prompted newspaper editorials and did very little to change what people wore, because fashion has never responded well to being told it will kill you. The transition toward the more covered, structured silhouette of the later Regency and Regency to Victorian period was partly a response to this, a gradual acceptance that warmth was a reasonable priority, but stays remained throughout. The Regency corset was long-waisted, sitting high under the bust and extending down over the hips, laced firmly enough to smooth the figure and provide the structured base that the high-waisted fashions required. It was not the waist-compressing device of later decades, but it was not comfortable. Sit in it too long and you were aware of exactly which ribs were pressing against which seams. Breathe too deeply, and something reminded you not to. Men were not exempt from the project of artificial silhouette, though they'd deny it with their last breath. The fashionable Regency gentleman's coat was cut to emphasize a broad chest, narrow waist, and square shoulders, a silhouette that was sometimes genuine and sometimes substantially assisted by padding in the chest and shoulders and, for men who required it, a discreet corset of their own. Corsets for men were sold openly. They were also denied vigorously by the men who wore them, who insisted that their excellent figures were simply how they looked, naturally, as a product of constitution and character. Beau Brummel himself, who set the standard for masculine elegance in this period, is believed by historians to have worn some form of support garment. Nobody asked him directly, because some questions in Regency England were simply not asked. The underlying logic of the corset was the same logic that ran through almost all Regency fashion. The body was not acceptable as it naturally was. It required management, shaping, constraint, presentation. The natural figure, soft, varied, responsive to gravity and reality, needed to be corrected into something more decorative before it was fit for public consumption. That this correction was uncomfortable, occasionally damaging, and required hours of assistance to achieve was not a contradiction. It was the price of being presentable, and Regency England paid it without complaint, largely because complaining would have required a breath deep enough to split a seam. The Regency diet, for those wealthy enough to have a varied one, was impressive in quantity and genuinely alarming in safety. Great houses served multi-course dinners, removes, entrees, desserts that went on for hours, featuring dishes that had been prepared well in advance, transported from the kitchen, often located in a separate building or basement well away from the dining room, specifically so cooking smells wouldn't intrude on the family's living spaces, and kept warm through the application of hope and pewter covers. Pewter, incidentally, contains lead. The wine was frequently adulterated, watered down by merchants, sweetened with lead acetate to smooth the sourness, or stored in lead-lined vessels that leached quietly into every glass. Spices were used lavishly, not just for flavour, but to mask the taste of meat that had moved past its optimal window. Sauces were thick and heavily seasoned for exactly the same reason. And the kitchen itself, open fires, no refrigeration, communal pots, servants who were not always in excellent health, was an environment in which food safety as a concept had not yet been born. The dinner table arrangement in a great house was impressive to look at and somewhat precarious to eat from. The first course featured a range of dishes placed on the table simultaneously in a system called service à la française. Everything arrived at once, arranged symmetrically, and guests helped themselves or asked footmen to pass dishes across the table. This meant that the fish at the far end had been sitting for roughly the same amount of time as the soup nearest you, that the sauce in the boat had been cooling since it left the kitchen, and that the elaborate cold jellies and creams at the dessert end had been assembled earlier in the day and had been waiting patiently in whatever passed for a cool room in a pre-refrigeration house. The visual effect was magnificent. The food safety mathematics were not for the anxious. Meat was the centerpiece and the most significant risk. Without refrigeration, large cuts of meat were salted, potted, pickled, or smoked for preservation, or they were consumed quickly after slaughter, and the condition of the animal at the time of slaughter was simply accepted as a variable you dealt with afterward. Game birds were frequently hung for a period before cooking, a practice that tenderized the meat and developed the flavor, but required the cook to make a judgment call about exactly where on the spectrum, from maturing to decomposing any given bird currently sat. Some cooks were better at this call than others. Dinner guests found out which kind they had encountered usually by the following morning. The kitchen staff who produced all of this operated in conditions that would close a modern restaurant instantly. Open hearths, rather than controlled ovens, meant temperature management was intuitive rather than precise. Water for washing came from the same sources as everything else. The concept of separating raw meat preparation from cooked food handling was not part of kitchen protocol because the understanding of cross-contamination didn't exist. Cooks were skilled and often remarkably talented within the constraints of what they were working with, but the constraints were considerable, and then there was the broader food supply. Bread could be adulterated, chalk, alum, and ground bones were documented additions used to bulk or whiten cheaper loaves. Milk was frequently watered, and the water used to water it was not always clean. Beer was adulterated, butter was adulterated. The adulteration of food for commercial advantage was widespread enough that it barely registered as scandal. It was simply a background condition of the market. Frederick Ockham's 1820 treatise on food adulteration catalogued the practices in such detail that it caused genuine public uproar, and also got him quietly run out of the country by the interests he had embarrassed, which suggests that the food was not the only thing in Regency England that was not quite what it appeared to be. To understand the Regency era, you have to understand the man it was named after, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, who stepped in to govern because his father, King George III, had lost his mind. Not metaphorically. George III suffered from a condition that produced episodes of acute psychosis. He spoke without stopping for hours, addressed people who weren't there, foamed at the mouth during the worst episodes, and wrote letters to trees. His doctors responded with the standard treatments of the age: restraint in a specially designed chair, dousing in cold water, blistering of the skin to draw out the illness, and a straitjacket when he became violent. The nation was informed he was unwell, and treated updates about his condition with the same polite, horrified fascination one might give a carriage accident happening in slow motion. The fact that the most powerful country in the world was functionally being run by a dissolute, debt-ridden prince, while his father was tied to a chair somewhere in Windsor Castle, was something everyone knew, and no one fully acknowledged. George III's illness, now believed by many historians to have been porphyria, a metabolic disorder with neurological symptoms, though the diagnosis remains debated, had first appeared decades before the Regency period, causing episodes that terrified his court and his family. and were managed with the same combination of secrecy and aggressive medical intervention that characterized everything else in this era. The king would recover, then he would relapse, then recover again. Parliament watched each cycle with the barely concealed anxiety of an institution that needed a functioning monarch, and kept getting a man who was attempting to conduct state business from inside a straitjacket. The doctors assigned to his care were not reassuring. The most prominent among them was a physician named Francis Willis, who had made his reputation treating the mentally ill at a private establishment in Lincolnshire, and who brought to the royal bedchamber the same methods he used there: restraint, cold baths, the blister plaster applied to the skin to draw out the corruption that was assumed to be causing the symptoms. When the king spoke irrationally, Willis stared him down until he stopped. When the king became violent, he was restrained in the specially constructed chair. When he showed improvement, Willis took credit. When he worsened, the illness took the blame. This was medicine as performance, and the audience was the most powerful family in Britain. The political consequences of the king's incapacity were enormous. Parliament spent years debating the terms of the Regency, how much power to give the Prince of Wales, what restrictions to impose, how to manage the legal fiction of a monarchy temporarily without a functioning monarch. The prince himself was not a reassuring alternative. He was in debt, was estranged from his wife, was unpopular with a significant portion of the public, and had spent the years of his father's illness demonstrating a talent for extravagance that sat badly against the backdrop of a country at war with Napoleon and straining under the associated economic misery. What the country had, essentially, was a king in a chair in Windsor and a regent throwing parties in London, and the gap between those two images tells you almost everything you need to know about the Regency era. Out in the country, people were losing jobs as industrialization disrupted traditional trades, food prices were rising, and the Luddites were smashing machinery in protest. In London, the Prince Regent was commissioning another wing of the Brighton Pavilion. The king, meanwhile, went fully and permanently blind in his final years, lost the last of his reason, and wandered the corridors of Windsor Castle talking to people who'd been dead for decades. He died in 1820, having not been meaningfully present for the last 10 years of his reign. The nation mourned appropriately, everyone moved on. It had been a long 10 years. Regency society ran on a system of social rules so elaborate, so arbitrary, and so ruthlessly enforced that a single misstep could close every door in London before tea. The rules were not written down in any single place. They lived in the collective consciousness of the ton, the upper crust of society, who administered them with the quiet efficiency of a very well-dressed tribunal. A woman could be ruined by being seen alone with a man who was not her husband or a close male relative, not ruined in any literal sense, but socially ruined, which in practical terms was worse, because it meant no invitations, no marriage prospects, whispered conversations that stopped when you entered the room, and the very real possibility of spending the rest of your life in respectable but humiliating exile in the countryside. A man could lose his reputation over unpaid gambling debts faster than over almost any moral failing. You could be cut, socially ignored, looked through as if you didn't exist, by someone with slightly higher social standing, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. The cut was the social weapon of choice, and it was wielded with extraordinary precision. To cut someone was to look directly at them in a public setting and give no sign of recognition, to pass them in a room, to hold their gaze for one blank moment, and to continue as though they were furniture. This required nerve, good timing, and the absolute social confidence that comes from knowing you outrank your target. A cut delivered by someone of inferior standing was just rudeness. A cut delivered by a genuine arbiter of the ton was a sentence. It told every witness present that this person was no longer worth acknowledging, and in a society where your social standing was entirely dependent on who acknowledged you, the effect cascaded quickly. Elmac's assembly rooms in London were the most formalised expression of this system. 7 patronesses, aristocratic women of unassailable social standing, controlled access to the Wednesday evening subscription balls, and their decisions were absolute. To receive a voucher for Almack's was social validation of the highest order. To be refused one was a public declaration that you were not quite acceptable. The criteria were never fully stated, which was part of the point. The patronesses knew what they were looking for and knew what they weren't, and the uncertainty of the standard kept everyone perpetually anxious and on their best behaviour. A young man could be denied entry for arriving after 11 o'clock. The doors closed at that hour regardless of rank, and the Duke of Wellington himself was famously turned away for appearing in trousers rather than the required knee breeches. The Duke accepted this without visible distress, which was itself a display of impeccable social fluency. Introductions were the mechanism by which social interaction was officially permitted to occur. You did not speak to someone you had not been formally introduced to, regardless of how many times you'd been in the same room. You did not introduce yourself. Introductions were performed by a mutual acquaintance, and the social mathematics of who could appropriately introduce whom was its own complex calculation. Calling cards were left at houses to signal intent to visit. Morning calls conducted in the afternoon, because the terminology was designed to confuse, lasted between 15 and 30 minutes and no longer. The conversation remained light, and the underlying evaluation of everything from your dress to your conversational fluency to the quality of your upholstery was conducted simultaneously and invisibly. All of this sounds exhausting. It was exhausting. People describe the season with a combination of longing and shell shock that suggests the experience of performing social perfection for 4 months at high intensity left marks that the subsequent 8 months in the countryside were barely sufficient to heal. But you went back the following year, because the alternative, social invisibility, rural obscurity, the slow diminishment of simply not being there, was somehow worse. The rules were absurd, the rules were absolute, and everyone agreed to both of these things simultaneously and kept dancing. In Regency England, gambling was not a vice. Or rather, it was a vice, but it was the correct kind of vice. The kind that happened in clubs and drawing rooms and was therefore entirely acceptable as long as you lost with good manners. White's and Brooks's, the great gentlemen's clubs of St. James's Street, had betting books in which members wagered on absolutely everything. Horse races, elections, the sex of an unborn royal child, whether a particular nobleman would recover from his illness, how many minutes it would take for a flight across the room. Fortunes were lost in a single evening at cards. Estates that had been in families for generations changed hands over a game of whist. Young men arrived in London from the country, entered a club, and left having signed away their entire inheritance in I O Us, that their horrified fathers would spend the next decade paying off. The astonishing thing is not that this happened. It's that it was considered entirely normal, even fashionable, and that a man who refused to gamble at all was regarded with faint suspicion, as if there might be something slightly wrong with him. The games themselves range from the slow burn of whist, a card game requiring skill, partnership, and sustained concentration across an evening, to the pure velocity of hazard, a dice game in which fortunes could change in the time it took to exhale. Faro was the fashionable obsession of an earlier generation, a banking card game in which the house odds were relatively modest, and the pace was fast enough to make large losses feel like they had happened very quickly and very far away. Like a bad dream, you were still technically inside. Macao, 21, piquet, the vocabulary of Regency gambling was extensive because the practice was constant, and a man who didn't know the games was a man who hadn't been paying attention. Women gambled too, though it occupied a more complicated social position. Gambling in private drawing rooms and at card parties was acceptable for ladies, and some women gambled seriously and expensively. The Duchess of Devonshire in the previous generation had been famous for her enormous gaming debts, a fame that combined admiration for her daring with the reliable schadenfreude of watching someone important lose spectacularly. At Almack's, the stakes at the card tables were deliberately kept modest by the patronesses, who understood that providing both a marriage market and a financial ruin machine in the same room was asking too much of their young subscribers. This restraint was considered thoughtful management. The debt produced by gambling created its own parallel economy of crisis and obligation. A gambling debt was a debt of honour, theoretically payable, before any other obligation, including commercial debts, because to owe a tradesman was unfortunate, but to owe a fellow gentleman was a matter of character. Men who couldn't pay their gaming debts could not show their faces at the clubs. They could not continue in polite society. They fled to the continent where English creditors had less immediate reach, and living was cheaper, and they wrote anguished letters home, asking fathers and uncles to settle their obligations and promising, with the optimism available only to the chronically indebted, that nothing like this would ever happen again. The horse racing dimension of Regency gambling deserves its own mention. The turf, racing at Newmarket, Ascot, Epsom, was not merely a sport, it was a financial ecosystem of extraordinary complexity, involving breeding, form study, inside information, bookmakers, corrupt jockeys, and the eternal human conviction that this time, with this horse, at these odds, things would be different. They were sometimes different, usually in the wrong direction. The races continued, the bets were placed, the horses ran, and somewhere in the crowd, a young man in excellent boots was calculating how to explain to his father that the estate was now technically owned by someone he'd met twice at a club. Marriage in Regency England was a legal contract, a financial transaction, and a social performance. And it was only occasionally, as a kind of bonus, a romantic arrangement. For women of the gentry, marriage was not an option. It was the entire plan. There was no career path, no independent income, no respectable way to live as a single adult woman past a certain age that didn't involve being a dependent in someone else's household, labelled a spinster, and subtly pitied at every family gathering for the rest of your natural life. A woman brought a dowry, money or property settled on the marriage, and in exchange received a husband who, from the moment of marriage, legally owned everything she brought with her. Her property, her income, her future inheritance, all of it became his. She could not sign contracts, sue in court, or make any legal decisions independently. She was, in the eyes of English law, a feme covert, a covered woman, her legal identity absorbed into her husband's the moment she said "I do." The negotiations that preceded marriage were conducted by the families involved with the focused attention of business partners entering a significant contract, because that is essentially what they were: the settlement, the legal document establishing what money and property accompanied the bride, what jointure she would receive if widowed, what provisions existed for future children, was negotiated between lawyers and fathers and sometimes the groom, with the prospective bride's input ranging from marginal to non-existent depending on the family. Love was not irrelevant to these calculations, but it was not the primary variable. Compatibility of fortune and family connection were the primary variables. Love, if it occurred, was a welcome addition, like good weather on a day you'd planned carefully regardless. The process of getting to the negotiation stage required the performance of courtship in conditions of such elaborate supervision that genuine acquaintance was almost structurally impossible. A young couple in Regency England could not be alone together. could not correspond privately without it being considered a near-formal declaration of intent, could not sit together at dinner without their conversation being audible to neighbours. They danced together at balls. 2 dances in a row was already a signal that would be noted and discussed. They walked in groups in public parks. They exchanged remarks in drawing rooms full of their family's friends. From this carefully managed sequence of supervised interactions, they were expected to form a judgment about whether they wished to spend their lives together. Some of them managed it. Some of them arrived at the altar having exchanged perhaps 30 minutes of genuinely private conversation and found out who they had married over the subsequent decades. Divorce was theoretically possible and practically out of reach for almost everyone. It required a private act of Parliament, an expensive, time-consuming, publicly humiliating process that exposed the grounds of the marriage's failure to parliamentary debate and newspaper coverage. It was almost exclusively available to men who could divorce a wife on grounds of adultery. A wife could not divorce a husband for adultery alone. She had to prove adultery combined with additional aggravating factors such as cruelty, incest, or bigamy. The number of divorces granted per year in Regency England was in the single digits. Unhappy marriages were not generally ended. They were endured, managed, arranged around, or, for those with sufficient social standing and mutual agreement, conducted in a state of parallel indifference, while both parties pursued their own arrangements discreetly and everyone pretended not to notice. Second marriages happened, particularly for widows and widowers, though they carried their own social calculations. A widow with money and children was a different proposition than a widow without either. A widower with young children needed a wife practically rather than romantically, and found one usually within a year or 2, because there were children to manage and a household to run, and grief was real, but so was logistics. Every spring London transformed. The aristocracy and gentry who had spent the winter on their country estates doing whatever aristocrats did in winter, descended on the city en masse for what was known as the season, a compressed, frantic, brilliantly orchestrated marriage market that everyone pretended was about culture and society, and absolutely nobody pretended wasn't about marrying off their daughters. The season ran from roughly April through July, centred on a calendar of balls, assemblies, concerts, picnics, Almac subscription nights, and afternoon calls that left participants socially exhausted and financially depleted and somehow also desperate to do it all again next year. Young women making their debut, their formal entrance into society, were presented at court, a ceremony involving an enormous hoop skirt, a specific number of feathers in the hair, and a deep curtsy to the Queen that had to be executed without stumbling, falling, or accidentally making eye contact. The stakes were high. A good season could mean a good match. A bad season, no proposals, a social misstep, a reputation dented by rumour, could follow a woman for years. The presentation at court was its own particular ordeal. The gown required for the occasion was not the fashionable high-waisted muslin of everyday Regency wear. It was the hoop skirt, a surviving relic of 18th century court dress that persisted as a formal requirement long after it had vanished from ordinary fashion, because the monarchy had opinions about tradition that fashion was not permitted to override. You arrived at St. James's Palace in this construction, waited for hours in a line of similarly constructed young women, and their mothers were announced, walked forward, curtsied to the appropriate depth, kissed the Queen's hand if she was receiving kisses that day, or simply curtsied if she was not, backed away without turning your back on royalty, which in a hoop skirt the width of a doorway required genuine spatial reasoning, and were done. The whole interaction lasted perhaps 90 seconds. The preparation had taken months. The ball was the central arena of the season's marriage market, and it operated with more precision than it appeared to. Dancing was not merely entertainment, it was evaluation, conducted at close range, with your hands in someone else's, and your conversation fully audible to your neighbours in the set. A man who asked you to dance was paying you a public compliment. A man who asked you for 2 dances was signalling serious interest. A man who asked for a third, which was not done, which was beyond the pale, which would cause murmuring among every chaperone in the room, was either making a declaration or making an error of social judgment that would follow him for some time. The woman on the receiving end navigated all of this while maintaining a pleasant, lively expression, and not appearing to calculate, because appearing to calculate was not attractive, and attractiveness was the goal, and appearing to pursue the goal too obviously undermined the goal. It was a logic loop that required considerable mental agility to inhabit gracefully. Chaperones were mandatory. A young unmarried woman at a ball without a chaperone was a young woman asking for exactly the kind of gossip that ended seasons prematurely. Mothers, aunts, married older sisters, family friends of appropriate standing, someone had to be present and watchful at all times, positioned in the row of chairs along the wall where the chaperone sat and observed and evaluated every young man on the floor with a professional focus of scouts at a sporting event. The financial cost of a season was significant enough to strain moderate fortunes considerably. London lodgings for several months, the wardrobe required for daily calls and evening events and morning rides and Sunday church, and the presentation itself. Muslin gowns wore out quickly, and the fashion moved fast enough that last season's dress was already faintly outdated. The tickets, the subscriptions, the evening entertainments. Families made this investment because the return, a well-made match for a daughter, justified the expenditure in straightforward economic terms. A daughter well married was financially secure for life. A daughter not married was a continuing expense. The season was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Mental illness in Regency England occupied a peculiar and terrifying legal space. If someone decided you were mad, and someone could mean a husband, a father, a business rival, or 2 physicians willing to sign a document, you could be committed to a private madhouse without a trial, without appeal, and without any fixed term of confinement. Private madhouses were businesses. They charged fees, they took patients, and they had absolutely no incentive to declare anyone recovered, because a recovered patient was a paying patient who left. Conditions varied enormously. Some establishments were reasonably humane for the era, others were dungeons, but the defining feature of all of them was that you were there until the person who had put you there decided you could leave. For women particularly, this was a mechanism of control so straightforwardly brutal that it barely needed disguising. A wife who was inconvenient, a daughter who refused a marriage, a widow whose relatives wanted her money. The threshold for madness was exactly as low as someone needed it to be. The definitions of madness in Regency England were broad enough to be almost meaningless as a clinical standard and precise enough to be enormously useful as a social tool. Excessive grief was a symptom. Uncontrolled anger was a symptom. Refusing to eat or eating too much. Expressing religious visions. Masturbation, which was believed to cause insanity, was also considered a symptom of it, a convenient circularity that kept the concept well stocked with patients. For women, the category of nervous disorders provided a holding pen for almost any behaviour that disrupted the smooth running of domestic life. A woman who objected too loudly to her husband's conduct could be described as having a nervous condition. A woman who said things that were embarrassing or inconvenient could be described as deranged. 2 physicians who were not required to examine the patient extensively or to agree on a specific diagnosis could sign the document that opened the madhouse door. Bethlem Royal Hospital, popularly known as Bedlam, was the most famous public institution for the insane, and it carried a reputation that had been actively cultivated for decades as a place of spectacle. Until 1815, the public could visit Bedlam on Sundays to observe the patients, paying a small entrance fee, walking through the wards, watching the inmates with the same detached curiosity one might bring to a zoological exhibition. This was not considered cruel by the standards of the time. It was considered educational, and it provided the hospital with income. The patients who had not consented to become exhibits were there regardless. Reform was beginning to stir in this period. The York Retreat, founded by Quakers in 1796, had demonstrated that treating the mentally ill with kindness, regular meals, occupation, and physical freedom rather than chains and darkness produced better outcomes, which surprised people who hadn't considered that obvious possibility. Parliamentary investigation into the conditions of private madhouses had begun. William Tuke's model of moral management was being discussed. The key word is beginning. For the Regency patient committed to a less enlightened establishment, these reforms were not yet operational facts, but future improvements that would arrive too late. You could, in theory, petition for release. You could write letters if you were allowed writing materials, which was not guaranteed. You could hope that the person who had committed you had a change of heart, or died, or found the fees inconvenient, or was persuaded by a sympathetic lawyer. You could recover visibly enough that continued confinement became difficult to justify, even to a compliant physician. These were your options. They were not robust options. They were the options you had, and the Regency era produced a quiet, steady stream of people who disappeared into private establishments and were not heard from again, absorbed into a system that had no particular mechanism for disgorging them. In Regency England, if a gentleman felt that another gentleman had insulted his honour, there was an established, ritualised process for resolving it that involved pistols at dawn and a very real chance someone went home in a box. Duelling was illegal. It was also completely commonplace among the upper classes. The process had rules. Of course it had rules. Everything in Regency England had rules, beginning with the offended party sending a formal challenge via a second, a friend who would manage the logistics, negotiate terms, and generally try to find a face-saving resolution that avoided actual shooting. If no resolution could be reached, the duel proceeded. Pistols at a measured distance, a signal, and the expectation that the participants would behave with composure even as they attempted to put a ball through each other. Sometimes the combatants deliberately missed, firing into the air or at the ground, which was considered a socially acceptable resolution, once honour had been theoretically satisfied. And sometimes they didn't miss. People died, over perceived slights at dinner parties, over a badly phrased letter, over a woman someone claimed to have insulted, and the survivor, provided the deceased had been the challenger, often faced no legal consequences of any significance. The role of the second was theoretically to prevent the duel from happening. Seconds were supposed to negotiate, to find the form of words that would allow both parties to consider their honour, satisfied without anyone discharging a firearm. In practice, seconds were often young men as hot-headed as their principals, selected precisely because they were loyal friends rather than cool-headed diplomats, and their negotiations sometimes consisted largely of confirming that both parties were still equally offended and establishing the logistics of where and when. The meetings took place at dawn, early enough to avoid witnesses, in parks or open fields on the edges of cities, with a surgeon in attendance who was there specifically because people got shot and someone needed to deal with the immediate consequences. The pistols used were not the inaccurate flintlocks of popular imagination, or rather, they were flintlocks. But the duelling pistols commissioned specifically for this purpose were made to a high standard, carefully matched in weight and balance, with triggers set to a light pull that minimised the physical effort between intent and consequence. They were beautiful objects, kept in fitted mahogany cases with accessories for cleaning and maintenance, and they were made specifically for putting balls into human beings at close range. The care lavished on their manufacture tells you something about how seriously the institution was taken. The offences that provoked duels covered a range that moves, to the modern eye, from the serious to the bewildering. Accusations of cheating at cards were at the serious end. This was an allegation of fundamental dishonesty and could not be tolerated. Remarks about a man's family, his wife, his lineage, political disagreements that escalated, a look held too long over a woman at a ball, a comment made at dinner and reported back with embellishments. The Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, had been involved in a duel earlier in his career. The Duke of Wellington fought one while he was Prime Minister in 1829, against someone who had questioned his political positions, because being simultaneously head of government and willing to stand in a field at dawn and be shot at was apparently not considered contradictory. It was considered, in fact, rather admirable. It demonstrated that a man's honour was not a ceremonial concept, but a living commitment he was prepared to defend with his body, which is a very Regency way of thinking about what honour is and how it should be maintained. The illegality of duelling was real, but functionally theoretical. Prosecutions were rare. Juries were reluctant to convict. The law acknowledged the practice existed and declined, most of the time, to do anything substantive about it, which was a form of official complicity that allowed the whole institution to continue operating in the comfortable grey zone between the illegal and the acceptable. It persisted well past the Regency period before genuinely declining, and even then it declined gradually, the last recorded fatal duel in England occurring in 1845, a reminder that things do not end cleanly simply because everyone has agreed they are absurd. While the gentry was busy worrying about whether their curtsy had been deep enough, somewhere nearby a child of 5 or 6 was being lowered into a chimney. Chimney sweeps employed climbing boys, small children, often orphans or children from desperately poor families, sold or apprenticed to a master sweep, who were sent up the inside of narrow flues to scrape and brush out the accumulated soot. The work required bodies small enough to fit inside chimneys that might be as narrow as 9 inches across. Children climbed in darkness, by feel, using elbows and knees against the rough brick, breathing soot-thick air, frequently becoming wedged and having to be freed by lighting a small fire below, a method of encouragement that charitably could be described as motivation and less charitably as torture. The health consequences were catastrophic: eye problems, respiratory disease, and a particular form of scrotal cancer, the first occupational cancer ever identified medically, described in 1775 by Surgeon Percival Pott, who noted its appearance specifically in chimney sweeps and still saw the practice continue for decades. The master sweep who employed climbing boys operated in a legal and commercial grey zone that the Regency era found perfectly comfortable. Boys were apprenticed, formally with paperwork, with the nominal oversight of parish authorities in the case of pauper apprentices, to sweeps who were responsible for their housing, feeding and training. What this meant in practice varied entirely with the character of the master. A decent master might treat his boys reasonably well within the considerable constraints of the work. An indecent one had almost total authority over children who had no family to advocate for them, and no recourse to any authority likely to interfere. The boys slept in the soot they had collected during the day, wore the same clothes for weeks, ate whatever was provided, and went back up the chimneys the next morning. The mechanical alternative was available. Brushes on extendable poles that could clean a chimney from below without sending a child into it had been developed and demonstrated. Master sweeps rejected them. They argued that the brushes didn't clean as thoroughly, that complex flue geometries required a human climber, and that the alternative would destroy their trade. The real objection was economic. children cost less than mechanical equipment, could be obtained through the apprenticeship system at essentially no purchase cost, and were small enough to access spaces that rods could not reach. The argument that this was not a sufficient justification for sending children into chimneys was made repeatedly by reformers, and repeatedly failed to achieve legislation with real force behind it. Jonas Hanway, the philanthropist, had campaigned against the practice in the 1770s. The Climbing Boys Act of 1810 during the Regency period itself nominally prohibited the apprenticing of boys younger than 8 and required that they give consent, which is a law so easy to circumvent it barely deserves the name. 8-year-olds in the power of a master sweep and with no alternatives available give consent in roughly the same way that anyone gives consent when the alternative is homelessness and starvation. The act was not meaningfully enforced. Boys continued going up chimneys. William Blake had written about the climbing boys in Songs of Innocence in 1789, the small figure in black against white snow, the voice that said with a cheerful note he had nothing to fear, a poem that reads less like comfort and more like the precise notation of a society looking directly at something terrible and choosing to see something tolerable instead. Charles Lamb wrote about them. Parliamentary committees heard evidence, clergymen preached, and in the same city where those sermons were delivered, on the same mornings, children climbed into chimneys and scraped and coughed their way through the dark, and came down black, and did it again tomorrow, because the fireplaces of Regency England needed cleaning, and nobody sufficiently powerful had yet decided that the cost of that cleanliness was unacceptable. In the absence of social media, Regency England had the next best thing: newspapers, scandal sheets, and print caricatures that circulated gossip, rumour, and gleefully savage commentary about public figures with an enthusiasm that would feel very familiar today. London in the Regency period had dozens of newspapers, and several of them existed primarily to report on who had been seen with whom, whose marriage was in difficulty, which nobleman had been seen leaving a certain address, and what exactly the Prince Regent had spent the public's money on this week. Caricaturists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank produced prints that depicted politicians, royals, and aristocrats in terms of such gleeful savagery that they were regularly bought, displayed, and laughed at by the very people they lampooned. The Prince Regent was a particular target, his extravagance, his weight, his romantic entanglements all fair game in images sold openly in print shop windows. Ordinary people would stand in the street outside these shops, reading the prints in the window, laughing at the powerful, which is either a charming democratic tradition or evidence that some things have not changed at all. The newspaper landscape of Regency England was competitive, partisan, and largely unrestrained by the libel laws that would develop later in the century. Papers aligned themselves with political factions, Whig papers, Tory papers, radical sheets, and wrote about their opponents with a candour that made modern political commentary look restrained. Personal attacks, accusations of corruption, imputations of cowardice, suggestions of sexual misconduct, all of this appeared in print, circulated throughout London by a distribution network of coffee houses, reading rooms, and private subscription. A coffee house typically received multiple papers and allowed customers to read them for the price of a cup of coffee, meaning that the daily news was accessible to a much broader social range than the cover price alone might suggest. The society gossip columns operated on information fed by servants, by social observers, by people with grievances, and by people who simply enjoyed the destruction of others' reputations from a comfortable distance. A mention in the wrong column at the wrong time could do the work of 100 whispered conversations, spreading the information to thousands of readers and fixing it in print in a way that word of mouth, however efficient, could not fully replicate. The column's power lay in its permanence. A rumour spoken could be denied, could fade, could be talked over. A rumour printed was a rumour with evidence, or at least with the authority that print conferred on anything it chose to discuss. The caricature prints deserve particular attention because they operated on a different register from the written press, visual, immediate, cruel, in a way that bypassed the social restraints that governed spoken and written communication. Gilray's prints of the Prince Regent, showing him as grotesquely fat, surrounded by empty wine bottles, negligent of his duties, ridiculous in his pretensions, were sold for £1 or £2 and displayed in the windows of print shops on Fleet Street and the Strand where anyone passing could see them. This was satire as public entertainment, available at street level, requiring no literacy, accessible to anyone with eyes and 30 seconds of walking time. The targets of this satire had essentially no recourse. They could not sue effectively, could not suppress the presses, could only absorb the laughter and maintain, if they could, the performance of dignity. For private individuals, the threat was different, but equally real. The Morning Post society columns and their equivalents tracked the movements of the ton with the attentiveness of a surveillance system, noting arrivals at Bath, departures for the continent, appearances at balls, absences from expected events. An absence could mean anything: illness, bereavement, social disgrace, financial crisis, and the column's reticence about specifying, which was sometimes worse than specification, because the reader's imagination filled the gap with whatever was most interesting. You appeared in print when you didn't want to be noticed. You weren't mentioned when you desperately wanted acknowledgement. The press was indifferent to both preferences, which is again entirely recognisable. If the physician had been bad enough, the patent medicine industry was its own special catastrophe. Regency England had a thriving market in bottled remedies sold directly to the public, requiring no prescription and no physician's involvement, which was sometimes genuinely for the best given what physicians were likely to do. These remedies promised to cure almost everything: dropsy, gout, nervous debility, female complaints, a category that covered roughly everything a woman might experience, weak constitutions, impure blood, and general malaise. The ingredients were creative. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold freely, used for pain, anxiety, sleeplessness, coughs, and almost anything else that presented itself. It was given to adults and children alike, marketed as soothing and calming, which it certainly was, in the way that anything that renders you unconscious is soothing and calming. Mercury compounds were used for syphilis, for skin conditions, for fevers. Arsenic in careful doses was taken as a tonic and applied to the complexion. The cumulative effect of a well-stocked Regency medicine cabinet was essentially a slow tour through the periodic table's most dangerous elements. Laudanum was the great universal solvent of Regency discomfort. It came in bottles, it tasted of alcohol and bitterness, and it worked, by which people meant it reduced pain, softened anxiety, encouraged sleep, and quieted crying infants with a thoroughness that nothing else available could match. Godfrey's cordial, a preparation of laudanum, treacle, and water, was sold specifically for use with infants and young children. It soothed them immediately and completely. It was also gradually killing them, or at minimum establishing in their small bodies the beginnings of a dependence that the age didn't have the vocabulary to describe. Physicians occasionally expressed concern about laudanum's habituating effects. The market for it continued to expand regardless, because it worked and nothing else did, and the habit it produced was not yet classified as a medical problem requiring its own treatment. Thomas de Quincey published his Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, describing in lucid and harrowing detail what regular laudanum use actually felt like from the inside. The dreams, the dependency, the inability to stop, the progressive invasion of the substance into every corner of daily life. The book was a sensation. It was read widely, discussed enthusiastically, and admired as literature. It didn't meaningfully reduce laudanum consumption, because the Regency era was very good at admiring the description of a problem while continuing to engage with the problem itself. The patent medicine trade operated with minimal regulatory oversight, which is a way of saying it operated without any regulatory oversight, because the concept of medicinal regulation in its modern form did not yet exist. A manufacturer could claim on his label that his preparation cured whatever he chose to say it cured, could include whatever ingredients he chose to include, and could sell the result to anyone willing to purchase it. The ingredients were sometimes listed and sometimes not. When listed, they were sometimes accurate and sometimes aspirational. Certain preparations contained alcohol in quantities that would have required a different label in a later century. Others contained opiates unlisted. Others contained compounds of questionable safety, described in language sufficiently vague that no specific claim could be disproved. The people who bought these products were not stupid. They were people in pain, people with sick children, people managing chronic conditions for which the physician's alternative was bleeding, and mercury, people who were entirely reasonable to prefer a bottle from the apothecary to a consultation that might leave them weaker than they started. The patent medicine industry understood its customer and served them reliably in the sense that the product always arrived, always cost what was advertised, and always promised relief. Whether it delivered relief was a separate question, and the market proved decade after decade that the promise was more than sufficient. Among women of the upper and upper middle classes in Regency England, breastfeeding your own children was considered inappropriate, inconvenient, and potentially damaging to the figure, and so the wet nurse industry thrived. A wet nurse was a woman, typically from the working class, who had recently given birth and was therefore producing milk, hired to feed someone else's infant while her own child was either fed by another woman, given pap, a thin paste of bread and water, or in some cases simply not given priority. The wet nurse often lived in the employer's home, subject to strict rules about what she ate and drank and how she spent her time, on the theory that her health and diet directly affected the quality of her milk. Meanwhile, her own infant, the one her body had produced that milk for, managed as best it could. The arrangement was commonplace enough to be unremarkable. That it required one woman's motherhood to be interrupted so that another woman could avoid the inconvenience of her own is a detail that received very little comment at the time. The hiring of a wet nurse was treated as a domestic staffing decision of the same practical order as hiring a cook or a lady's maid, something to be arranged before the birth, with references checked, character assessed, and terms agreed. The ideal wet nurse was young, healthy, recently delivered of her first child, of good moral character, calm in temperament, and producing abundant milk of the correct quality. Creamy, sweet, not too thin, not too rich. All assessments that were made by physicians and household managers with the same confident authority they brought to everything else they knew very little about. A wet nurse who drank too much, who had loose morals, who ate the wrong foods, was believed to transmit these qualities through her milk into the infant she fed. The character of the child was thought to be shaped partly by the nurse, which gave the selection process a moral urgency on top of the practical one. What happened to the wet nurse's own baby while she was employed was a question that the comfortable classes preferred to leave at the door with the delivery arrangements. The answer, documented in the records of the period, was frequently grim. A wet nurse living in an employer's household could not simultaneously feed her own child. Her milk, diverted to the employer's infant, was not available for her own. Her child might be sent to a hired woman, a dry nurse, who fed it pap, the bread and water substitute that provided calories of a sort but not the nutritional profile of breast milk, and not the antibodies that breast milk transferred. Infant mortality among the children of wet nurses was measurably higher than among other infants of the same social class, a fact that was known, recorded, and accommodated within a social framework that had decided the arrangement was necessary, and therefore the consequences were acceptable. The medical establishment had opinions about wet nursing that shifted across the period. Some physicians argued strongly that mothers should nurse their own children, that the bond formed through nursing was important, that maternal milk was better matched to the maternal infant, that the wet nurse system introduced unknown variables into the child's early development. These arguments gained traction slowly. The social pressure running in the opposite direction, that nursing was animal, that it disrupted a lady's figure and social calendar, that it was simply not done among women of a certain standing, was considerably more immediate and considerably more persuasive to the women navigating it. The wet nurse herself occupied an odd domestic position, more trusted than an ordinary servant, because she was in bodily contact with the family's infant for hours every day, but not elevated to the status of a family member or even an upper servant. She ate well because her diet affected her milk. She rested because her rest affected her milk. She was managed carefully as a resource. Whether she missed her own child, whether the sound of a different infant's crying mapped onto her own body's responses, whether the knowledge of what her employment cost her own baby was something she carried, these were questions the household did not ask and the records did not answer. If you were feeling unwell in Regency England and you had the means, the prescribed remedy was often a trip to take the waters, to Bath, to Cheltenham, to Tunbridge Wells, where you would drink from and sometimes bathe in the local mineral springs under the supervision of physicians who assured you, with great conviction, that this would help. The waters at Bath, for instance, were warm and mineral-rich, pumped up from underground springs and consumed in the pump room by elegantly dressed visitors who held their noses slightly and drank because the doctor said to. The theory was that the minerals in the water corrected imbalances in the body, the humoral thinking again, dressed up in slightly more scientific language. Whether or not the waters did anything medically useful, the space served an undeniable social function. They were places to see and be seen, to arrange marriages, to conduct flirtations under the relatively relaxed surveillance of a resort town, to gamble, to attend concerts, and to feel, in a general way, that one was taking one's health seriously, while also having quite a nice time. The water at Bath was warm, slightly sulphurous, and mineral in a way that lodged in the back of the throat and introduced itself to your senses before you had decided whether you wanted to meet it. Visitors drank it in the pump room, a grand, elegant, chandeliered space that was simultaneously a medical treatment facility and the social hub of Bath, which tells you something about how Regency England handled the boundary between health and entertainment, which is to say it didn't draw one. You arrived at the pump room, paid your entrance fee, took a glass of water from the pump attendant, drank it while surveying the room for acquaintances, and considered yourself engaged in both medical treatment and morning social calls at the same time. Efficiency of a kind. The prescribed dose was typically 3 glasses taken on an empty stomach each morning, walked around the pump room between each glass to encourage the waters to circulate through the system, which sounds like it was designed to give the physicians something to prescribe, while the patients did something that was at minimum harmless. 3 glasses of warm mineral water in the morning would not cure gout, rheumatism, or nervous exhaustion, which were among the conditions most commonly sent to Bath for treatment. They would, however, hydrate you, give you a reason to leave the house, and provide a social context in which to do it, and for patients whose primary complaint was the isolation and sedentary misery of upper-class country life, the social prescription was not entirely without merit. Sea bathing had developed alongside the spa towns as a parallel medical enthusiasm, with the additional element of cold water immersion that the spa experience lacked. Seaside resorts, Brighton, Weymouth, Scarborough attracted fashionable invalids and healthy visitors alike, drawn by the theory that immersion in cold seawater strengthened the constitution, stimulated the circulation, and corrected a variety of conditions that the warm springs were less suited to address. Sea bathing in this period was not the casual recreational activity it became later. It was conducted from bathing machines, wooden huts on wheels that were drawn into the sea by horses, allowing the bather to descend steps directly into the water from the modesty of the closed machine, invisible from the shore. Female bathers were sometimes assisted by dippers, women employed by the bathing establishments whose job was to physically immerse the client in the water, holding them, dunking them if prescribed, and ensuring they emerged without drowning, which was considered a poor advertisement for the cure. The Prince Regent's enthusiasm for Brighton had elevated it from a modest fishing village to the most fashionable resort in England within a generation, bringing the full social apparatus of the season to the seaside and ensuring that the medical benefits of sea air were available alongside a programme of balls, concerts, and the ongoing spectacle of the pavilion being increasingly elaborately rebuilt. Whether the sea air helped anyone is uncertain, but people felt better after several weeks of fresh air, social stimulation, regular exercise in the form of walking the promenade, and escape from the coal smoke atmosphere of London seems in retrospect less miraculous than it appeared. Death in Regency England was closer, more visible, and more elaborately managed than most modern people can easily imagine. Life expectancy for the general population hovered around 40 years when infant mortality was factored in, and even those who survived childhood faced constant exposure to diseases that modern medicine handles routinely. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, consumption, as it was called, smallpox in the years before widespread vaccination, childbed fever, and the general consequences of the medical treatments described above. Death happened at home, in the family bedroom, attended by family members and servants. The body was laid out in the house, mourning dress was donned, black for the immediate family, half-mourning greys and purples as time passed, and the rituals of grief were as codified as the rituals of the season. Mourning periods had specific lengths. A widow was expected to mourn for 2 years, scaling through the appropriate gradations of black to lavender, her social activities curtailed, her remarriage theoretically premature until the prescribed period had passed. The laying out of the body was performed at home, by women of the household or by a layer-out, a woman from the neighbourhood who performed this service professionally, washing the body, closing the eyes and mouth, arranging the limbs, dressing the deceased in appropriate garments. This happened within hours of death, before the body had stiffened fully, and it happened in the bedroom where the person had died, in the house where the family continued to live, surrounded by the furniture and objects of the ordinary life that had just ended. There was no removal to a funeral home, no professional facility where the body would be prepared out of sight and returned transformed and distant. The dead stayed home until burial, and the living arranged themselves around this presence with a matter-of-factness that speaks to how familiar death was as a domestic event. The funeral itself was a significant social occasion, with its own elaborate requirements. Black was mandatory, black horses, black plumes on the hearse, black armbands for the male mourners, full black dress for the women. The quality and elaboracy of the funeral arrangements were a direct signal of the family's status and the deceased's social standing, and undertakers, a profession that was formalising and professionalising in this period, were skilled at presenting options that allowed a family to spend significantly more than was comfortable in the service of appearing appropriately grieved. Mutes, professional mourners hired to stand at the door and walk in the funeral procession, dressed in black and arranged in poses of formal sorrow, were employed for significant funerals, adding a theatrical solemnity that the genuine grief of the family was not expected to supply unaided. Consumption, tuberculosis, had a particular cultural presence in Regency England that distinguished it from other fatal diseases. It was romanticised in a way that is, in retrospect, entirely bizarre and also entirely consistent with the era's aesthetic sensibilities. The pale, translucent, slightly fevered appearance of the consumptive patient was not far from the fashionable ideal of beauty, the delicate, ethereal, not quite of this world look that the lead-powdered complexion was attempting to manufacture artificially. Poets died of it. Young women died of it. The Romantic movement found in consumption a convenient metaphor for artistic sensitivity and spiritual refinement, which made dying of it seem, in certain cultural circles, almost appropriate. The person dying of it, coughing blood and struggling for breath over months or years, may have had different feelings about the romance of the situation. Their feelings were not the ones recorded in the poetry. Smallpox vaccination, Jenner's cowpox-based inoculation, developed in 1796, was available throughout the Regency period and represented one of the genuine medical advances of the era. Its uptake was uneven. Resistance to vaccination existed across the social spectrum. Suspicion of the mechanism, objection to the principle of introducing disease material into a healthy body, religious objection, and simple inertia all contributed to a situation in which a preventable disease continued killing people at significant rates alongside a working prevention. The gap between the existence of an effective intervention and its universal adoption is not, it turns out, a modern problem. Let's be precise about the landscape available to a woman of the Regency era who wasn't fortunate enough to be wealthy, titled, and strategically married. The options were, to put it charitably, limited. A gentlewoman could marry, or she could be a governess, a position that sat in the brutal social middle ground between servant and family, belonging fully to neither world, eating alone or with the children, socially invisible to guests, entirely dependent on the goodwill of her employer. She could do needlework. She could write, if she did it quietly and published anonymously. Jane Austen published her novels as by a lady, because a woman's name on a novel was either commercial poison or social embarrassment depending on the content. She could teach music or drawing to other people's children. She could, if she were of the working class, work in a factory, a shop, as a domestic servant in the fields, or in any number of occupations that paid very little and required her to do a great deal. What she could not do was vote, hold property in her own name once married, attend university, practice law or medicine, enter the clergy, or exercise any formal authority over almost anything. The governess position deserves its own extended consideration because it represents one of the more exquisite social cruelties the Regency era devised. The governess was, by definition, a gentlewoman who had fallen on financial difficulty through the death of a father, the failure of a family business, the absence of a marriage that would have provided the alternative. She was educated, she was refined, she possessed exactly the accomplishment she was hired to teach, and she was employed in a household that was socially equivalent to the one she'd grown up in, or perhaps slightly above it. She ate with the children, not with the family. She was not a servant. She did not associate with the servants' hall, which had its own hierarchy and its own social codes that a governess could not navigate without loss of dignity. She was not family. She existed in a social no-man's land, invisible at dinner parties, unnecessary at social calls, present at family prayers, addressed with the courtesy title that acknowledged her education and the treatment that acknowledged her dependency. Mary Wollstonecraft had published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, arguing with extraordinary lucidity that the education given to women, the accomplishments, the ornamental training, the deliberate cultivation of dependence and sentiment over reason, was not evidence of women's inferior capacity but of their inferior opportunity, and that this was not a natural arrangement but a constructed one, maintained by people with an interest in maintaining it. The book was read, it was argued with, it was dismissed by people who found its conclusions threatening, and praised by people who found its conclusions obvious. It did not change the law, it did not open the universities, it did not give wives the right to own property. It planted seeds that would take most of another century to produce visible fruit, and in the meantime the governess ate with the children, and the wife signed nothing, and the woman writer published as by a lady, and everyone agreed the arrangement was natural. Working-class women occupied a different world of constraint with different but equally firm boundaries. Factory work, textile mills, the expanding industrial economy, employed women and children at wages set deliberately below those of men, on the theory that women were secondary earners supplementing a male income rather than primary providers, a theory applied regardless of whether there was a male income to supplement. Domestic service employed an enormous number of women, maids of all work in modest households, specialized servants and great ones, in conditions of dependency as complete as any governesses, with the addition of physical labour that began before dawn and ended after the family retired for the night. A domestic servant's working day was not bounded by defined hours. It was bounded by the requirements of the household, which were constant. The remarkable thing, looking back at this landscape, is not that women accepted it. They had the options they had, and acceptance was not always passive, and resistance took forms that the available forms permitted. The remarkable thing is the gap between the intelligence, the capability, and the energy visible in the women of the period, in Austen's novels, in the letters and journals that survive, in the records of women who managed households, raised children, maintained social networks of formidable complexity, and did all of it within a legal and social structure that classified them as dependents, and what the era chose to do with all of that. While the Ton debated the merits of this season's muslin, and which assembly rooms had the superior orchestra, something else was happening in the same cities and towns. The poor in Regency England existed in a condition that the comfortable classes referred to as the lower orders, and interacted with primarily through the window of their carriages. The Poor Laws provided a system of relief, but relief that came with conditions, specifically the workhouse, a parish institution where those who could not support themselves were sent to live in exchange for labour. Workhouse conditions were deliberately made harsh under the theory that if they were too comfortable, the poor would choose them over employment, which tells you a great deal about what Regency England considered comfortable. Families were separated on admission, husbands from wives, children from parents. Work was tedious and physically grueling, picking apart old rope, breaking stones, turning treadmills. Food was minimal. The workhouse sat at the absolute bottom of social options, below poverty itself. The threat of it used to motivate every person above it to accept whatever terms the labour market offered. The old poor law system in the Regency period was administered parish by parish, which meant conditions varied enormously depending on the wealth of the parish, the character of its overseers, and the particular philosophy of relief that happened to be in operation locally. Some parishes operated outdoor relief, payments to the poor in their own homes, allowing families to remain together while receiving minimal support. The Spenumland system, adopted across much of southern England from 1795, supplemented the wages of the labouring poor according to the price of bread and the size of their families, an arrangement that maintained people above the threshold of starvation, while ensuring they remained permanently dependent on supplementation that employers factored into their wage calculations. It kept people alive. It also kept them poor, and it generated the kind of political resentment among ratepayers, the property classes who funded poor relief through parish rates, that would eventually produce the much harsher Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. The indoor paupers, those actually resident in the workhouse, inhabited a world of institutional uniformity that stripped away the markers of individual identity with systematic thoroughness. A uniform was worn. A name might be replaced by a number or a function. The day was scheduled from rising to sleeping, the hours filled with work that was deliberately unproductive, oakum picking, the tedious separation of old rope fibres with bare fingers until the fingers bled, produced a material used for caulking ships. But its primary purpose in the workhouse was not economic utility, but occupation, the filling of time with labour painful enough to reinforce the message that the workhouse was not a place one chose freely. Stone breaking produced gravel for roads. The treadmill, a large wheel turned by the collective weight of inmates walking on its paddles, generated power that was sometimes used for grinding grain and sometimes not used for anything at all, the point being the walking rather than the output. Children in the workhouse were separated from their parents and housed in their own wards, which in the better establishments included some education, and in the worse ones included primarily additional labour. Pauper apprenticeships placed workhouse children with tradesmen and manufacturers at ages that would cause modern readers to stop and reread the sentence. Children of 7 or 8 apprenticed to mill owners, to chimney sweeps, to any trade that would take them, the apprenticeship system providing the legal framework for what was in practical terms the transfer of children to whoever would accept them from the parish's books. The Regency era was not without voices arguing that the system was wrong, that poverty was not a moral failing requiring punishment, that separating families and grinding the destitute into compliance with insufficient food was not either just or productive. Robert Owen, running his mill at New Lanark on principles of decent conditions and worker education, was demonstrating that treating the poor as human beings did not in fact destroy the economy. His example was noted, admired, discussed, and largely not followed, because it implied obligations that the comfortable classes were not yet willing to accept, and changes that the economic interests of the period were not yet willing to accommodate. The workhouse remained, the treadmill turned, the oakum was picked, and outside the workhouse walls the knowledge of what lay inside performed its designed function of keeping everyone above it working for whatever they could get, while the working poor worried about the workhouse and the middle classes worried about the ton. The Prince Regent was throwing parties. Not normal parties. Parties that cost sums so grotesque that they caused parliamentary debate, that involved entire rooms redecorated for a single evening, that featured orchestras, cascading fountains of wine, hundreds of elaborately costumed guests, tables that stretched the length of enormous halls, and food on a scale that would have fed a small town for a week. Carlton House, the Prince's London residence, was redecorated so many times and at such expense that even his own supporters blanched at the invoices. The Brighton Pavilion, his seaside palace, was rebuilt in an extravagant Indo-Gothic style, featuring onion domes and a kitchen with cast-iron palm trees holding up the ceiling, because he felt it should look as though the food were being prepared in India by people who were very enthusiastic about palm trees. The country was engaged in a grinding, expensive war against Napoleon. The national debt was staggering. The poor were hungry. The Prince Regent had the kitchen palm trees installed anyway. The fete he threw at Carlton House in June 1811, celebrating the commencement of his regency, is worth examining in detail because it illustrates what happened when a man with absolute control over the public purse, no meaningful budget constraint, and a genuine aesthetic sensibility decided to throw a party. 2,000 guests were invited. The gardens were illuminated by thousands of oil lamps arranged in patterns that transformed the grounds, into something that people who had seen it described, with the slightly stunned quality of someone searching for adequate vocabulary, as a fairy landscape. A stream was diverted to run down the centre of the principal table, stocked with live fish, crossed by ornamental bridges, flanked by water plants, so that the guests dined on either side of a miniature river, while an orchestra played, and hundreds of servants moved through the rooms managing the logistics of feeding 2,000 people at the level of elaboration the prince considered appropriate. The food budget alone for major entertainments at Carlton House ran to figures that caused journalists to do arithmetic in their columns and present the results to their readers as a form of moral provocation. Here is what this evening cost. Here is what that money could have fed. The prince read these columns and was not visibly troubled by them, which was either serenity or obliviousness, and which it was depended on who you asked. His defenders argued that the entertainments employed hundreds of tradespeople, craftsmen, musicians and servants, that money spent on elaborate parties circulated through the economy rather than sitting inert, that the prince's patronage of architecture and the arts produced lasting cultural value. His detractors argued that this was the most expensive way imaginable to achieve employment outcomes that could have been arrived at by other means, and that the lasting cultural value of cast-iron palm trees in a seaside kitchen was open to debate. The debt was the most consistent feature of the Prince Regent's biography. He had been in debt since his early 20s, when he set up his own household at Carlton House and began furnishing it in a manner that required periodic parliamentary intervention to resolve the accumulated obligations. Parliament settled his debts more than once, each time extracting promises of future economy that lasted approximately as long as it took to identify the next room that needed redecorating. The prince's relationship with money was not characterized by a failure to understand arithmetic. He was an intelligent man, but by a fundamental conviction that the requirements of his position, as he understood them, could not be scaled to match available resources, and that the alternative to spending what his position required was to compromise the dignity of the monarchy itself, which was not an acceptable outcome. He was in the end genuinely influential in ways that outlasted the debt and the palm trees. His patronage shaped the architecture of London, Nash's Regent Street, the grand terraces of Regent's Park, and the cultural life of the period in ways that the caricaturists didn't capture. He had real taste, real knowledge of art and architecture, and real enthusiasm for what he was doing, which made him more interesting than his critics allowed, and does not fully resolve the question of whether a country at war with Napoleon required cast-iron palm trees in the royal kitchen. Both things can be true. They were, in fact, both true. He was brilliant, and he was ruinous, and he was the Regency. And the era is named after him for reasons that contain approximately equal parts admiration and irony. If marriage was the goal, childbirth was the terrifying consequence, and in Regency England it was a genuinely life-threatening event that women approached with a mixture of faith, preparation, and what can only be described as grim pragmatism. Childbirth happened at home, attended by a midwife or, for wealthier families, an accoucheur, a male physician who'd entered the field of obstetrics and was increasingly displacing traditional midwives, not necessarily because they were more competent, but because they were gentlemen and therefore considered more authoritative. The tools available if something went wrong were limited and frequently catastrophic. Forceps, introduced in the previous century, could assist in difficult births, but required skill and caused injury when misused. Infection, puerperal fever, killed women in the days following otherwise successful deliveries, spread by the hands of physicians and attendants who had no concept of germ theory and did not wash between patients. A woman who survived 10 pregnancies in Regency England had run a gauntlet that modern medicine would recognise as unnecessarily, preventably dangerous at nearly every step. The lying-in chamber, the room prepared for the birth, was arranged according to a set of established practices that were, with the benefit of hindsight, almost perfectly calibrated to maximize the risk of infection. Windows were sealed against night air, which was believed to be harmful. Fires were kept high to maintain warmth. Multiple attendants were present: the midwife or accoucheur, female relatives, ladies' maids, women of the household whose role was to assist, comfort and witness. The room was warm, crowded, poorly ventilated, and full of people whose hands had been in contact with any number of other surfaces before and during the proceedings. The understanding that any of this was a problem waited for Semmelweis and Lister, who were decades away. The midwife, where one was employed rather than a physician, brought to the work a body of practical knowledge accumulated through experience and passed through networks of female practitioners, knowledge about positioning, about the management of normal labour, about the herbs and preparations used to encourage contractions or ease pain. This knowledge was practical and in many cases effective within its limits. The limits were real. A genuinely complicated delivery, a badly positioned infant, a hemorrhage, a prolonged obstructed labour, exceeded what any attendant could address with the tools available. In these circumstances, the outcome depended on factors that no one in the room could control. The accoucheur's increasing presence in wealthy households represented a shift in the management of childbirth from female networks to male professional authority that was not straightforwardly an improvement in safety outcomes. Male physicians brought forceps, which midwives in England were not permitted to use, providing a genuine advantage in some difficult presentations. They also brought the prestige of professional medicine, which translated into authority in the birthing room and in the household's decisions about care. Whether any individual accoucheur was more skilled than an experienced midwife was variable. That he was male and credentialed meant his authority was less likely to be questioned, which was not the same thing as being more likely to be right. For the woman in the bed, the theological dimension of the experience was present throughout. Pain in childbirth was connected in the dominant religious framework to the consequence of Eve's transgression. The biblical statement that in sorrow thou shalt bring forth children was interpreted literally enough that proposals to reduce the pain of labour attracted objections on the grounds that it interfered with divine ordinance. Some physicians disagreed with this interpretation. The disagreement ran across the period and into the next, not resolved until the use of chloroform in obstetrics became widespread in the middle of the century, partly through the public example of Queen Victoria, who used it in 1853 and made the practice acceptable by the most effective argument available. A queen had done it, which settled the theology. In Regency England, the concept of animal cruelty as something deserving legal remedy was only just beginning to flicker into existence. Bear baiting had been outlawed in 1835, still a few decades away from our period, but cockfighting, dogfighting, bull baiting, and rat baiting were commonplace entertainments attended by all classes, conducted in purpose-built arenas and improvised venues alike. A bull baiting event involved chaining a bull in a ring and releasing specially trained bulldogs to grab and hold the animal's nose, a practice considered both sporting and, by some, a preparation of the meat that improved its tenderness. Rat baiting pits featured a dog released into a ring with a large number of rats, with spectators betting on how many the dog could kill in a given time. These were not fringe activities. They were popular, public, attended by respectable citizens alongside the rough trade, and advertised in newspapers. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals would not be founded until 1824, and even then it would spend its first decades fighting the perception that concern for animals was somehow eccentric or unmanly. The social range of animal baiting is worth emphasising, because it's tempting to assign it entirely to the working classes and leave the gentry out of the picture. The gentry went. Not to the same venues necessarily. Bull baiting in a market square and cockfighting in a purpose-built cockpit drew different crowds. But the enthusiasm for watching animals fight was not a class-specific vice. Cockfighting in particular was a genuinely fashionable pursuit. Cockpits operated in London within reasonable distance of the gentlemen's clubs. Cocks were bred and trained as seriously as racehorses, with bloodlines tracked and match records maintained, and the sums wagered on fights were equivalent to those laid on horses. A man who kept fighting cocks was engaged in a respectable sporting pursuit. That the sport involved watching two animals tear each other apart with metal spurs attached to their legs was the point rather than the objection. The philosophical justification for the absence of animal welfare protection rested on a chain of reasoning that seems, from the outside, designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Animals lacked rational souls. Therefore, animals could not suffer in a morally significant sense. They experienced sensation, certainly, but sensation without the cognitive superstructure of self-awareness was not suffering in the way that mattered. Therefore, inflicting sensation on animals, however intense, did not constitute cruelty in any meaningful moral category. Therefore, no legal protection was required. This reasoning was not held universally. Bentham's famous observation that the relevant question was not whether animals could reason or talk, but whether they could suffer appeared in 1789. But it was held widely enough to constitute the effective position of the law throughout the Regency period. The treatment of working animals, cart horses, dray horses, the animals that moved the city, occupied a parallel moral space. London ran on horsepower, literally, and the horses that pulled the carts, the carriages, the omnibuses were worked to exhaustion and beyond in conditions regulated by nothing except the owner's calculation of what preserved the animal's economic utility. A horse that could no longer work was not an animal deserving of comfortable retirement. It was an asset that had depreciated to zero, sold for what it could fetch, and processed into the various products that horses produced on their way to becoming glue, cat, food, and fertilizer. The people who worked alongside these animals, carters, coachmen, ostlers, sometimes developed genuine attachment to individual animals and treated them accordingly. The law made no distinction between the one who did and the one who didn't. The founding of the SPCA in 1824, driven by a combination of evangelical Christian concern for moral improvement and utilitarian argument about the ethics of suffering, marked the moment when the flicker became an organized movement. Its early prosecutions were mostly of working-class offenders, carters who beat their horses, men who ran baiting operations, which reflected both where the law was easiest to enforce and the class dynamics of who got prosecuted for what in Regency England. The gentry's cockfighting continued without interference for considerably longer, because the law operates with an accuracy that has never been entirely independent of social position. And so, here we are, at the end of a perfectly normal day in Regency England. You woke up and put lead on your face. You ate breakfast off a sideboard where something had already turned. You used a chamber pot that a stranger emptied by hand. You visited a physician who bled you and charged you for the privilege. You smiled carefully, because your teeth were held together mostly by optimism and someone else's misfortune. You laced yourself into clothing designed to make breathing a secondary concern. You navigated a social system so finely calibrated that a single wrong glance could end your entire future. You went to a party where the chandeliers cost more than a village earned in a year. And then you came home, got into a bed that was already occupied by things you couldn't see, pulled the curtains closed against the cold, and called it a good day. And the truly astonishing part? Most of them did. Most of them got up the next morning and did it again. The governess who ate alone, the climbing boy who went back up the chimney, the woman who signed nothing, owned nothing, decided nothing, and still somehow ran an entire household with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that invisible labour is still labour, even when no one is counting it. There is something genuinely humbling about looking at the past clearly. Not the romanticised version, not the candlelit ballroom version with the perfect skin and the witty repartee, but the real version, where the candles smelled like animal fat and the repartee was delivered over food that was quietly trying to kill you. People were intelligent in that world. They were funny and ambitious and tender with their children and furious about injustice and capable of extraordinary beauty in art and architecture and literature. Jane Austen was writing in this world. Keats was writing in this world. Turner was painting it. They were doing all of that in rooms that smelled of coal smoke, in bodies managing on laudanum and inadequate dentistry, inside a social structure that would strike most of us as somewhere between a prison and a performance. They were resilient in ways that are easy to underestimate because the resilience was ordinary to them. They didn't experience their lives as acts of endurance. They experienced them as lives, full of the same textures of boredom and excitement and grief and small daily pleasure that fill ours. The woman counting her morning dress gradations from black to lavender was also laughing at something her sister said at breakfast. The man scheduling a duel for Tuesday was also watching his daughter learn to walk. The climbing boy came down from the chimney and ate whatever there was and went to sleep. People contain all of it simultaneously. That has always been true. So tonight, as you settle into your clean sheets in your insulated room, with your functioning plumbing and your evidence-based medicine and your skin products that do not contain lead, take a moment. Not a guilty moment, not an anxious one, just a quiet one. Somewhere in the distance between you and 1814 is an enormous amount of human suffering, an enormous amount of human stubbornness, and an extraordinary accumulation of small decisions by ordinary people who kept going in circumstances that would level most of us by Tuesday. They didn't know they were building towards something better. They just got up, put the powder on and carried on. That's enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well.